So, good afternoon, everybody. Those of you attending the class from home, you cannot see my video. I don't know why. We are in the newest building at Texas A&M, but the cameras here always have issues with it. Technically, I was supposed to see my video, but it's all blank. It might appear in the middle of the lecture, as it happened before. So we continue today on the lecture about theories of demography, and starting on this slide about internal migration theories. But before I start there, I start again on this, continue on this chapter, I just wanted to give you some information here. First thing, there is this possibility that Texas A&M will not require masks in campus anymore, following the rule from the Texas governor. And since I'm a person who follows science, and you guys can all do the same thing, you can just go to Google and search for New York Times coronavirus, and you can get data about the coronavirus pandemic, the current data, and you can even have for specific for Texas. If you click here, you get the data for Texas. So the page at the top looks like that. And if you keep going down, you have both graphs here for daily reported new cases and daily reported deaths. So the main argument to stop requiring masks is because there is a decline in the number of cases and in the number of deaths in these last weeks. So that's the main argument for that. But we should not just look at the trends, we should also look at the level. And if we look at the level of death right now, early March in Texas, it's higher than what it was back in the summer of 2020. So at that time, summer 2020, we were all really scared about the pandemic and wearing masks. That's when we all started actually wearing masks more. And throughout the whole fall last year, fall 2020, we were all required to wear masks here, both in the state and of course at Texas A&M, and look at the levels of death and the level of cases throughout the fall. And now there is a negative trend, but it's still, the number of cases is higher than what it was in the fall. And the number of deaths is higher, not only compared to the fall, but also comparing to the summer. So the trends are going down, could be a result of exactly social distance and wearing masks, and also the vaccinations are happening faster now. But that doesn't make any sense to release and not wearing masks exactly at this point here. When you see the level, it's higher than what it was in the fall when it was required to wear masks. And now we already see businesses, grocery stores, not even requiring enforcement anymore. And we can just save these graphs here today, and then 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, see what happens. Or 2 weeks after March 10th, when this new rule comes out. You know, so, and I showed students since last year in the fall and also in the spring, these graphs, they keep going up. I mean, exactly when you have Thanksgiving, Christmas, and people start to interact more with each other, then you see these increases in number of cases and deaths. And releasing these basic measures, the prospect is not good. Just to make a point that this rule doesn't make any sense if you care about science, right? Another topic that I wanted to highlight before we continue on the lecture is about assignment 1. If you go to the course website, and here on quizzes, assignment, exams, I added this new link here for assignment 1. And the instructions for assignment, if you just click there, it's in this PDF file. And here I'm trying to, it's going to be pretty much an assignment that you're going to submit the same way through Canvas. You have already the questions here that you have to answer, and you have to answer them in up to 500 words. You answer them in just write in your computer or using Microsoft Word or using Google Doc. And then afterwards, you just upload that document to Canvas. So even if you use Google Doc, you can download it as a Word document and then submit it to Canvas. And the main purpose of this assignment, I highlighted here, is to highlight the fact that we should discuss population issues using scientific data to support our analysis and not rely on preconceptions and perceptions we might have about demographic subjects. There are people we discussed before that highlight the negative impacts of population, and some people that highlight the positive aspects of population growth, negative aspects of population growth, and the positive aspects of population growth. And here are the main questions, the main tests that you are supposed to develop in this assignment. And this is not about opinion. It's based on the course material, on things that we have been discussing and reading throughout the semester. All these questions are based on the course material. Based on course material, are there too many people in the world nowadays? Why population composition and population changes over time are important topics for demographers? Why spatial distribution is an essential topic to understand human populations? And then linking to this chapter that we're discussing now, how theories of demography are important to explain different trends and levels of mortality, fertility, and migration. Just give some examples, such as the examples that I give in class when I discuss these different theories. Discuss these different concerns related to population growth, transition, and evolution for current societies. Up to 500 words, and this is the format that I'm asking you guys to do it. And it's gonna the quizzes I usually do at noon in the following day of class, but since this one you have to write more, it's gonna be due only on Tuesday, next Tuesday at noon. And it's gonna be not only 1 point, it's gonna be 3 points, right? And just to highlight, I just updated something in the syllabus, is also in the website. If you just go, because I had separated here quizzes and extra credit. So I just put here all together, quizzes and assignments will be 25% of our grade. So you can have up to 105% in total throughout the whole semester. So you can have these 5 extra points. And how they are distributed, I reorganize here the tentative course schedule. So today I just posted assignment 1, 3 points, so it's 2 extra points here. And then next class on Tuesday, we have quiz 7, quiz 8. Assignment 2, 3 points, so another 2 extra points. And in the last class, we're gonna have assignment 3, 2 points, so 1 extra point. So 2, 2, 1, exactly the 5 extra points that we have here. And instead of 20 quizzes, we're gonna have 17 quizzes in total, right? So I just organize all this material together. And so everything else is the same. And the assignment, the idea is exactly for you guys to kind of think about the course material in a more critical way. So I'm giving you the opportunity for you guys to write it, and which is not one of, like usually in the exams and the quizzes, it's more straightforward questions. And here I give you the opportunity to do more of this critical thinking and interrelate different topics that we have been discussing throughout the semester. Okay? So both the assignment and the syllabus, the assignment 1 is here, and the syllabus is updated at the top of the calendar. and you can, on Canvas, the page to submit the assignment is going to open at 4:30 p.m. today and close at noon on Tuesday. But you don't have to wait Canvas to open at course, like our class finished today at 4:30, but you can already start working on it because the PDF file is exactly this one here. In Canvas, there will be no instructions, it will be just a reference to this direct link here, to this assignment, and you just pretty much upload it, and I'm using that tool, Turnitin, that can detect plagiarism. If you are looking at the textbook or the other sources, be careful, don't copy and paste things from the internet, from the textbook, write with your own words, okay? And 500 words is pretty much one page with 1.5 line spacing, okay? Any questions? Yeah.
So for the grading, it says on Canvas it's out of 1 point, but you mentioned it was 3 points. How's that going to work as far as the grading?
That's a good question. It's because the way that Canvas work, to give extra points, I actually on Canvas I say that's valid just 1 point. But when I graded students that got the maximum point, I will give 1 plus 2 extra. So that's how the system works in Canvas. It's different than eCampus. Okay. So in order to don't have to create another assignment to write down the extra points, I put everything in the same one. Okay. Can you already see it?
Yes, I can.
But it's not available, right, until 4:30?
Not.
Cool. Yeah, so that's a good question. So when you open Canvas, it's going to say that the assignment is worth 1 point, but that's just because how Canvas work. What I'm going to do is, like a student that got the maximum amount of points, I will give 1 plus extra 2, and then the student will get 3 in total, right? So that's how it works, and then the student will get the extra points there. When that's going to work for the same thing for assignments 2 and 3. Assignment 2, I will put also 1 point there, but the students can have up to 3. And assignment 3, students can have up to 2. Okay? All clear? So I will continue now on the lecture about theories of demography, and specifically here, I'm going to talk about internal migration theories. So again, what we are trying to discuss in this chapter are different groups of researchers, of demographers, economists, sociologists, political scientists, different social scientists look at different trends in migration over time, and they came up with major explanations about the reasons why people migrate. And looking specifically about internal migration, people moving within countries, the textbook highlights this 5 major groups of explanations, of theories about why people migrate within countries. So we have the Neoclassical migration theory, the new economics of labor migration, spatio-temporal migration theories, structuralism, which is also called neo-Marxist and center-periphery theories, and sociological human ecology. And the same theories, they also apply to international migration, and I will discuss them applied specific to international migration when we finish discussing here for internal migration. And the human ecology, we kind of talked about that too when we were discussing some theories related to fertility. It's that idea that we are looking at macro, aggregated characteristics of a population that make people, in that case, have more or less children, and in this case, migrate within countries, okay? So the neoclassical migration theory sees migration primarily as a function of geographical differences in the relative scarcity of labor. So the neoclassical migration theory was developed mostly by economists. And the main idea here is that they were looking, people migrate within countries, people migrate, for example, from rural to urban areas, because some areas have more availability of employment than others. So if, for example, rural areas, they experience stagnation in economic development and don't have as many job opportunities, so people start to migrate out of rural areas and move into urban areas. And in some cases, what happens is that even when in specific instances, in specific contexts, years, and population, maybe people keep migrating from rural to urban areas, but when people get into to urban areas, maybe their income might be even smaller than the one that they had at rural areas, right? So that can happen sometimes. So how this theory explains that? The main point here is that people migrate from one area to the other because the information they have make them expect that in the area of destination, they will have better job opportunities and better earnings than in the area of origin. So rural-urban migration, specifically in this case, a major example of internal migration, continues if expected urban income exceeds rural income. So even if in reality, the levels of earnings in urban areas are not that much better than rural areas, but the information that I have from my friends, from my family, is that if I move there, we have better earnings, I would tend to move. And the information that we have is always really limited based on news that I have, based on family, based on the social networks. And Todaro is the main economist who started looking at these trends and the reasons of why people migrate internally in countries. And he is the main person that started thinking about these economic reasons of why people migrate, and in some cases, why even some areas with fewer economic opportunities, why people keep migrating there, exactly because of the expected income. Limited this information that people have. Migration in this case is a result of individual decisions. The neoclassical migration theory is related to rational decisions of individuals. So it's really an analysis done at the micro level, at the individual level. And the neoclassical migration theory is also sometimes known as the functionalist theory. And the idea is that internal migration causes labor to become less scarce at destination and scarcer at the origin. So if I have a rural population, okay, overall the size of that population is smaller, but in terms of job opportunities, I have too many workers for the job opportunities there. So people start to move away. So the area of destination will have more workers, so less labor will become less scarcer. And the origin, the rural areas will have fewer workers to the job opportunities. And this process will result in growing convergence between wages at sending and receiving areas. So a major point of this theory, really based on this economic indicator differences across areas, is that rational individuals will migrate from one area to the other, trying to improve their labor outcomes in terms of being employed and have better earnings. And you're going to reach a point in which you're going to have equilibrium between these spaces. And migration would continue to happen until you reach this equilibrium. And there is no major discussions here about macro structural effects of the society. It's all more based on individual decisions, right? Which will be criticized by other groups of scientists. The second one, the new economics of labor migration. This theory argues that most migration is in developing countries can only be understood as a household rather than individual decision. So they're kind of like still not looking at the whole aggregate level, macro level, but they jump from the individual to the household level. People decide to migrate not only to satisfy that individual needs or individual decisions. It's more related to, I want to provide a better life standard to my whole family, to my household. So I decide to move away, either by myself or with my whole family, to provide better resources to my family. So migration decisions generate what's saying here as an income diversification rather than maximization. So the idea is that maybe if I get my family from rural area and go to an urban area, also my wife will be able to find jobs in the urban area. So we're gonna have more sources of income in the household. It's not just increasing my own income, but it's diversifying the income of the household. Or in another case, maybe both the husband and the wife, they work in the rural area, and only the husband migrates to an urban area. In that case, because he thinks he will make more money and will send some money back to the family that stayed in the rural area. So again, you are creating a diversification of income in which a member of the household is still working there of origin and someone else moved to an urban area and is making more money there. It is a conscious attempt to overcome fading markets and socioeconomic inequalities. And again, it still is a theory that really emphasizes the rational decisions of individuals, and it still is seen as a micro level theory. Although we jump from the individual into the household level, still we are not talking about aggregate level reasons of why people migrate. And this approach is not able to explain long-term global migration patterns and trends and how these are connected to broader development processes. So the neoclassical economic theory, new economics of labor migration, work more at the micro level, individual and household decisions. They provide some good insights of why people migrate, but the overall trends of global migration, even within countries, is not well explained by these theories. The spatio-temporal migration theories define migration as constituent part of a broader development process. So we start to talk more about the aggregate level. Development processes tend to coincide with increased levels of migration and overall mobility. So we start to say that processes such as modernization, capitalist economic development, and capitalist economic development happens in different ways, even within countries. There is a lot of concentration of economic development in specific areas of countries. Here in the US, it's more decentralized compared to other countries. You have several cities that have really strong economic development, and even rural areas in the US are completely different than rural areas in developing countries. In the US, when you say that something is a rural area, that place, it's 5 miles away from all the services that you might need in terms of grocery store, in terms of medical services, in terms of education, right? But some developing countries, they have really concentrated economic development in specific cities in more these urban areas, and that generates a lot of migration from rural to urban areas because exactly this centralization of economic development. And some of the demographic transitions, areas that experience really, which are the areas that experience steeper declines in mortality and fertility faster than the others, that will create changes in the age composition of that population. And remember, because if we decline fertility, you're going to have fewer children in the short term and then fewer people in labor ages later in the next decades. If you decline mortality, you're going to have more people in older ages. And all that changes age composition of specific areas in the country, and it's related to internal migration, right? So internal migration, it's related to these development processes that happen in different levels, in different ways, even within countries, okay? And, oh yeah, just to let you know here, I cannot see the chat today. So if you want to ask a question, just please unmute yourself and ask. Oh, I can see the chat now. So you can ask a question on the chat as well. The structuralism theory, which is based on Marx's theory, in which talks about these different spaces, even within countries of center and periphery, criticize the functionalist theory. And the functionalist theory is the one that we discussed first, also called neoclassical economic theory, and it's actually related to the push and pull factors that we discussed at the end of the last lecture, right? The structuralism theory sees a general patterns of disruptions, dislocations, and migrations intrinsic to the capitalist society. So the structuralist approach, it's more an analysis at the macro, at the aggregate level. And the functionalist and neoclassical and the push and pull factors are more associated with individual level, household level characteristics. And the whole idea of the functionalist approach, or the explanations about migration, is that areas that have better job opportunities will receive more migrants, but then as they receive more migrants, they will start to have fewer job opportunities proportionate to the number of workers, and that will tend into an equilibrium across space through exactly internal migration. So the structuralist approach is more at the macro level and look at these different levels of dislocations, disruptions, and all of these inequalities created by the capitalist society. And the functionalist emphasizes more the micro individual level decisions, but both of them have similar assumptions. So they are different in several ways, but they have some similarities. In that case, both of them assume that more development leads to less immigration. Areas that have more economic development will tend to have more job opportunities, better earnings in those jobs, so people will tend to stay. Those areas will tend to attract people, so they will have more in-migration, and then less out-migration. The correct term here, if you're talking about internal migration, is out-migration. Immigration, that in this case would be more appropriate if you're talking about international migration, as we saw in the previous lecture. And also these two groups of theories, they have also similar assumption by saying that higher development differences across areas leads to more migration. So more differences in terms of job opportunities and economic development within a country across its areas will make people move more in between these areas, in between less developed areas, which are usually more rural areas, into more developed areas that tend to be bigger cities or urban areas. Okay? The sociological human ecology, like I said before, and that's the one that Poston always emphasizes, is here we are trying to understand why people migrate based on aggregated information of the whole population, So this analysis here is really done at the macro level. The ecological theory of migration focuses on population characteristics to predict migration, population characteristics, not individual, not household characteristics. And some of their main questions: why some areas increase through migration? Why some areas decrease? Why some areas are not influenced by migration? It does not ask questions specific about why people migrate to this or the other area. It's more concerned about the aggregate level. Migration is the major mechanism of social change and adaptability for human populations. Populations redistribute themselves via net migration to attain equilibrium. So it still also has that equilibrium aspect that we talk about in the Neoclassical economic theory, but in this case, we are talking about populations. We are not focusing on individual reasons. And looking at more this aggregate level, the human ecology approach, the sociological human ecology approach, is always looking at the interdependence of these four major concepts: population, the way that specific population is organized, how is the environment, what are the environmental characteristics of that population in terms of what are the resources, in terms of water, in terms of climate change, in terms of resources available, natural resources available to that population, and what's the overall level of technological advances that that specific population has, right? So we're talking about aggregating information, environmental, natural resources. How is that population organized as a whole? Are all the means of productions on the hands of private companies or the state? How are people organized in terms of labor activities? Is it more decentralized in a more advanced society, or it's still a society in which you have a man doing the work outside of the household and woman inside? And what about technological advances? About everything. Technological advances in terms of capacity of people to produce a lot of goods in industries in a faster manner because of having more automation, or medical technology, medical services. So all this, but always looking at the aggregate level, right? And then finally, the theory is related to international migration. And here, what I did about both these sets of slides, the internal migration theories and international migration theories, I added some more things than what they are available in the textbook. And for these specific sets of slides here, I used this paper by Douglas Massey that he wrote with some other colleagues. I mentioned before Douglas Massey, he's a professor at Princeton University, a major demographer in the area of migration, or international migration specifically. And one thing that he has that's really interesting about his papers, and this one here from 1994, is that he summarizes all these previous studies that try to explain what are the reasons of people migrating. And he concentrates more on studies related to international migration. And looking at previous explanations about why people move between countries, he classified these theories in these two major groups. Some theories that explain what are the reasons of why specific international migration flows are starting, and what are the reasons, what are the theories that help us explain why after international migration started, why do they continue, right? And within the initiation of international migration, so those theories that try to explain why specific international migration flows start are exactly the Neoclassical economics theory that we discussed before, the new household economics of migration, the segmented labor migration theory, and the world systems theory. And after specific flows of people moving from one country to the other start, what are the reasons that make people continue to migrate between these countries? And these theories here help us understand the network theory, institutional theory, and cumulative causation. Okay? And I'm going to discuss a little bit more about them. And Douglas Massey, he has a paper published in 1997 that I also like to discuss that paper more in detail in a graduate class that I have, because he not only explains what these theories are, but then he tests those theories for the specific case of international migration from Mexico to the US. So what I like about his approach is that he just not chooses one or two or three theories to try to explain international migration flows. He tries to get most really refined data about specific international migration flows, really refined data, and then he tests all these theories. And some of the questions that he asks about people try to test the neoclassical economics theory, some other, the new household economics of migration, the network theory. For example, the network theory, you can ask people in Mexico, do you know someone who lives in the US? Do you have any family members, any friends? So if those people have more friends in the US, they will tend to have higher chance of migrating. That's the hypothesis of the social network theory. So by collecting that specific data, he can try to test that theory. And this refined database that he has is called the Mexican Migration Project, in which he goes to specific communities in Mexico and asks people there if they had other household members who already left to come to the US, and what are the characteristics of those places. And then they link that data into US data, right? So he is not doing this theoretical discussion, but he is actually testing for the specific case of migration from Mexico to the US, what are the major reasons? And his major finding is that social network matters. Okay, there are some differences in the labor markets of Mexico and US that made people start to migrate from Mexico to the US, but why this migration keeps going, at least in previous decades, even after Mexico had reached some levels of development, exactly because it created this social network between those countries. People from Mexico know other people who in the US who travel from Mexico here to the US, okay? So I'm going to discuss these theories a little bit more. In terms of the initiation of international migration, as I mentioned, I'm going to discuss these four major theories. The neoclassical economics, also known as the supply-demand framework. The new household economics of migration is the same thing that we talk about internal migration. It's when we try to have a diversification of income. And if I move from a rural area to an urban area within a country, I can send money back to the rural areas. If I move from one country to the other, I can send money into my home country, from the country where I moved to. When I send money from my destination country to my home country back, I'm sending remittances to my family that maybe stayed behind, and I'm providing this diversification of income to my household that stayed back in my country of origin. So remittance is exactly this process of people sending money back to their house, to members of their household that stayed back in their country of origin, and that provides a diversification of income. And that's the emphasis of this theory. The segmented labor market theory, also known as a demand-driven theory, mentions that the contemporary societies are usually divided in two sectors, the primary sector and the secondary sector. The primary sector usually employ people that are well educated with good salaries and benefits. And the secondary sector usually employs people with low wages, unstable jobs, and these jobs are usually rejected by the native population. So these are usually jobs that are taken, for example, by undocumented immigrants in the US, okay? And the world systems theory is the theory that explains also more at the aggregate level. Peripheral countries are most likely to send migrants to poor nations because more developed countries, they have better job opportunities than developing countries, right? So just giving a little bit more discussion about these theories related to initiation of international migration. The neoclassical economic theory of international migration is the oldest and best known. So it was first developed, as I mentioned before, by economists, and it started more also on studies related to internal migration, related to rural-urban migration. It focused on labor migration. People decided to move to other areas because they are looking for better job opportunities. Migration happens due to individual decisions, these individual cost and benefit decisions. Like, what are the costs of me moving to another country? I will have to pay for an air ticket, or I'm going to have to pay for a bus ticket or a train ticket. I'm going to have to pay for a coyote if I enter through the southern border. I'm going to have to pay for a tourist visa and then overstay, or I'm going to have to pay for a visa, a work visa in the US. And other costs, I'm going to maybe have to leave my family behind because I cannot take them with me. So there are also emotional costs there. And the main idea here is that people make these decisions in order to maximize their income. But not necessarily they will have better income when they reach the new country, but they at least expect. It's the same the discussion that Todaro did in terms of internal migration. If people expect that they will have better earnings, in this case, in another country, they will keep moving. Even though maybe when they reach that new country, they might not get a better earnings than what they had before, but they had that expectation. People usually move from low-wage countries to high-wage countries, right? So the migration from Latin America to the US, from Asia to the US, it's really going to that sense, and also from Africa to Europe, and from Asia to Europe as well. The new household economics kind of challenge the neoclassical theory, and migration decisions are not influenced only by individuals. Okay, they are influenced by individuals as well, but also they are influenced by families and households, these larger units. But still, we have an emphasis on economic outcomes as the main reasons for migrating. Migration happens to increase individual earnings and to minimize household risks and protect family from failure markets. So from market failures. So it's pretty much people trying to migrate to other areas, either to send money back through remittances and provide better life for people who in their household who stayed back, or if everybody migrates into a new country, all those people will tend to have different sources of income and maximize the household income, right? So we jump, whenever we are doing this analysis, we are not denying individual decisions, which they are still considered, but now we also emphasize family and household decisions. The segmented labor market theory explains migration flows as a result of the demands of the economic structure of industrial societies. And it's also kind of related to the push and pull factors that we mentioned before. Some countries, they have not as many job opportunities. They don't have characteristics that would provide a good life standard to people. So these characteristics make people move away. They push those people away. And some countries have better socioeconomic development better life standards, and they will attract more people. They have pull factors that attract people into those countries. And overall, the segmented labor market theory, it's also more done at the macro level. It divides, it kind of emphasizes that the capitalist society divides labor markets in two sectors. That's why this theory is also known as the dual labor market theory. The primary sectors I mentioned before usually have better job opportunities, higher paying jobs, better benefits, health benefits, social security, and so on, and good working conditions. And the secondary jobs have more unstable jobs, low paying, limited benefits, and more dangerous working conditions. And employers use usually migrants to fill jobs in the secondary sector. For example, I'm now doing a research project about how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting the restaurant industry in the US. And I'm doing this project in partnership with Dr. Robertson from the Bush School, Dr. Pham from the A&M School of Law, and with Dr. Wong from the Statistics Department. And we are collecting data from owners of restaurants trying to understand how the pandemic is affecting the restaurant industry in the US. And one of our goals is to understand if immigrants, they tend to be more willing to work in the restaurant industry and be susceptible to more dangerous conditions, working conditions, than US-born population. One hypothesis is that now that we have all these policies of increasing the possibility of request unemployment benefit in the US, then some people might prefer to receive unemployment benefits than to work in the restaurant industry, in which the level of earnings is really low and it's dangerous because you are making yourself exposed to get the virus. But people who have access to unemployment benefits in the US, they need to be US-born people, or at least they have to be documented immigrants, right? So technically, undocumented immigrants, the hypothesis is that they won't have access to these unemployment benefits. Although the restaurant industry has really low paying jobs, they will still expose themselves to these dangerous conditions and work in those places because they don't have all the alternatives, right? So see that this segmented labor market theory that was developed and is discussed in the textbook before the pandemic helps us understand some of the changes that are going on right now, right? So these theories, they explain this urbanization process from rural to urban areas and also migration from developing to developed countries, but also helps us understand things that are going on right now in the country, right? And that's the main idea, that theories that keep explaining well changes, contemporary changes in society, they get stronger, they get more validated as sources of explanation for those specific issues. The next one, the world systems theory. Migration is the result of a globalization of the market economy. In the process of global industrialization, population is released from traditional industries, from farming, from agricultural activities, state-owned industries and handicrafts. And this creates a mobilized population to move both internally within countries and internationally between countries. And this global market economy attracts employees with higher human capital, with higher levels of education, with higher levels of skills to specific global cities. So what do we mean about human capital here? We talk about knowledge, training, experience in the labor market, skills that people can use to develop their occupations. educational attainment, productivity. So people with better or higher human capital tend to move to specific cities that are these global market centers, such as New York City, LA, and Chicago, right? And the other three theories that Massey and his colleagues emphasize of being the reasons of why people keep migrating: the neo-network theory, the institutional theory, and the cumulative causation. This 1997 paper that I mentioned before is exactly this one here by Massey and Spinoza. The migration, the social network theory emphasizes that migrants establish interpersonal ties. They get to know people that moved before them into other countries. So I know a friend who moved from Mexico to the US. And that friend told me, if I move right now, my friend is going to find me. He's going to find me a job there because he knows the employer, and he referenced me to his employer. And then I can move to the US and I will have possibility of getting a good job. So I create some ties with another country through friends, through families, right? Once started, migration sustains itself through diffusion. So it starts because of maybe these major economic changes or economic differentials between countries, but then it continues because it starts to create these links between these two countries. Another set of theories emphasizes the role of institutions. Institutions facilitate or profit from the continued flow of migrants. Organizations help perpetuate migration in the face of government attempts to limit the flows of migrants. So even if we talk about forced migration, forced international migration, of Africans being forced to move to the American continent to work as slaves here in the American continent. And I'm talking about the American continent, I'm talking about the US, Central America, and South America. In that case, you had specific employers, institutions, organizations that would profit from having this forced international migration from Africa to the American continent. So that they were profiting from these flows of migrants, right? And so, and in that, those institutions can be either private or public institutions. You could have like a policy of the government actually try to bring migrants from other places because that would contribute to their country. For example, in Brazil, after the end of slavery, which happened in 1888, the federal government started incentivizing migration from European countries and from Japan specifically of workers that could work in agricultural activities that previously were done by slaves. So in the 1930s, there was this huge push from the federal government to bring immigrants from Japan to work in the coffee plantation and from Italy and Germany as well. So those were organizations, federal government, public institutions incentivizing these international migration flows. And cumulative causation sees migration, emphasizes that migration has an impact on social environments of sending and receiving agents. So when someone migrates from one country to the other, those people will have an impact on the areas of destination, but also on the areas of origin. And there are a series of different factors. So the main idea here is that I have to take into account all these different theories that we discussed before in order to understand the factors that cause migration and make migration keep happening in the future. And among these three here, I will emphasize the network theory in this next slide. Migration network theory focuses on these interpersonal ties, as I mentioned, these like ties with people that I know that moved before to another country. These ties connect migrants, formal migrants, potential migrants and no migrants in the areas of origin and destination. Even if I'm not a migrant, the fact that I know people that migrate to another country increases my chance of being a migrant. So I become a potential migrant. And maybe I will become actually a migrant exactly because of these ties. The social networks increase the likelihood of migration. They decrease the migration risks and costs. What is a major cost? A major cost is me moving to another country and getting the country of destination, not having a job. But if I have friends and other ties in this country of destination, it will decrease the chances of me being unemployed. So it decreases my costs. It's not just the cost of moving from one country to the other. These networks increase net earnings through migration. So understand the idea that if I have connections, I will get better paying jobs than the ones that I have now. And these networks made it easier for migrants to find jobs and access resources in the country of destination. Okay? So here are the major references. The paper itself was chapter 2. The main chapter was chapter 2, Theories of Demography from the textbook. But for the migration portion of this lecture, I use all these different references here. Harris, Massey, Ravenstein, and Todaro. And I also use some slides from this other textbook by Weeks. Okay? So the next chapter in our course is related to, okay, what did we talk so far here in this course, in this semester? We talked about, gave an introduction to demography. What are the major components? Mortality, fertility, migration. And we talked about trends of demographic characteristics in the world, in the US. We talked about age, sex composition. And now, after talking about all these variations of demographic characteristics, we talked about theories of demography. What are the factors that explain all these changes of demographic indicators over time? So I showed you introduction to demography, changes over time across societies, theories that explain those changes. And now this chapter, I'm going to say, where can you get data to exactly see these trends? And there are three major sources of demographic data to analyze migration, fertility, and mortality. That's discussed here in the textbook. And it classifies these three major data sources: the national censuses, registration systems, and surveys. The national census, what is the national census? It's when I go into a population and I collect information about all individuals of that population. That's the census, right? That's the census for a specific country. When I go to a country and I collect information about everybody in that country. It's the total process of collecting, compiling, and publishing demographic, economic, and social data pertaining to all persons in a country or in a specific territory at a specific time point. So just now, we had the 2020 census here in the US, which we call decennial census or demographic census. And the idea is that a series of data was collected for the population, and the idea was to reach all individuals, right? We usually have these household questionnaires, but we collect information about age, sex, race, ethnicity for all individuals in all households in the US. And the main purpose of national censuses is to obtain data about the size, composition, and distribution of population. Size, because I can count how many people are there. Composition, because I can break down my population by age, sex, marital status, socioeconomic status. And I can also see which areas have more people than others, or which areas have more people of specific characteristics than others. So I can understand the size, composition, and distribution of the population. Some of the demographic characteristics that are collected in national census are related to fertility, mortality, education, whether people are employed or not, what are their level of earnings, what are their health status, do they have chronic conditions, do they have access to health care, health insurance. And we can also collect information about migration, information on country of birth, citizenship, language, migration, ethnic heritage. Okay? In these national censuses is not something new. It has been implemented throughout human history. So the first censuses were collected in ancient Egypt, China, and Rome. And the first modern census in large countries, the US is one of them. The 1790 US Census counted 3.9 million people, and it counted people in different subgroups. How many, they differentiated people by being free white males by whether they were over or under the age of 16 to determine fiscal and military obligations of citizens. So it counted how many free men were over the age of 16, how many free white men were under the age of 16, how many women, and how many slaves. Right? So it counted at that time this information, and the idea was to capture the overall size of the population, but by breaking it down by free white males over the age of 16, we would have an idea of those that would be able to engage in military obligations as citizens. Another example is the 1787 census of the Kingdom of Spain that counted 10.4 million people. And by more recent years, more than 230 countries completed a census by the end of the 2010 census round. The 2010 census round here are censuses that happened between 2005 and 2014. And these censuses in all these countries, they relate to 96% of the world's population. So we have pretty much almost all population in the world being included in these counts. Only 7 countries did not complete the 2010 round: Eritrea, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, Somalia, Uzbekistan, and Western Sahara. So specific countries, because of political, economic reasons, did not complete the 2010 census. Right? In the US specifically, as I mentioned, I'm going to go more in detail here. The first census was in 1790. And all this information that I'm going to give to you in these next slides, they come from exactly the Census Bureau website. And here I provide the links that I got this information from. Right? The textbook does cite the 1790 census in the US, but I just got more detailed information from the Census Bureau itself. Here in the US, in 1790, assistant marshals listed the name of each head of the household and the number of persons in each household, broken down by these categories here. Free white males of 16 years and older to assess the country's industrial military potential, as I mentioned before. Free white males under 16, free white females, all other free people, and slaves, right? And this is the result from the census. So it counted a total of almost 3.9 million people. And these are the free white males of 16 years and upwards, including heads of families by all these different areas. And here mentioned like districts or more recently states. Free white males under 15 years, free white females, all other free people, slaves, and the total population in each one of these areas. Okay? And this table, I got it exactly from the Census Bureau website. Of course, the Census Bureau website, if you want to know demographic information about the US, is the main place to get data from the about demographic, economic, and social aspects of the American population. And so researchers in academia, professors, journalists, they always look at data from the Census Bureau. And specifically about the decennial censuses in the US, those censuses that happen every 10 years. So we have just now the 2020 census, before that the 2010, and so on, the 2000 and the 1990. Up to the 2000 census, we had two questionnaires in the US Census. One was the short form, and the other one was the long form questionnaire. The short form specifically asks questions, like fewer questions: name, sex, age, race, ethnicity, relationship with the head of the household, whether that household was rented or owned. But in the 2000 census, the short form also asked whether the person was a veteran or not. And the questions actually are two questions: whether the person was active in the military, whether the person served to the military before but is not active anymore, so I can measure whether that person is a veteran. And I also know in each area in which years that person served. So I know in which wars that person served. So this is the short form. The idea is that it's going to be implemented to everybody in the US. Everybody in the US will answer that question. How it's done: I have the questionnaire for a household. I go to that household and I get information about everybody. Usually an adult, of course, an adult, or usually the head of the household gives me information about all individuals. What's the information? Name, sex, age, race, ethnicity, and relationship with the head of the household. The 2000 census, the short form, had some extra questions. The long form in the census, up to the 2000 census, would ask more questions related to fertility, mortality, earnings, employment of all people in the household. Although it was called a long form questionnaire in the 2000 census, not everybody in the house in the country would answer the long form questionnaire. The long form questionnaire was actually a sample of the population. The word census technically is when we are implementing a questionnaire to everybody in a specific population. The word sample, we choose few people that are representative to the whole population. But since I have fewer people answering, I can ask more questions. It's not so expensive. But since the 2010 census, only the questions from the short form are included. And the question about being active in the military is not included in the short form anymore. The short form is pretty much name, sex, age, race, ethnicity, relationship with the head of the household, and whether the house is rented or owned. The long form questionnaire now is only asked as part of the American Community Survey. So since 2005, every year, we have the long form questionnaire that was revised and is now part of the American Community Survey. So the American Community Survey has the long questionnaire that's similar to the questionnaire that was implemented up to the 2000 census, the long form, and it's now done for every single year. The latest ACS available right now is from 2019. That's available for us. We are in the next few months, we're going to have access to the 2020 ACS as well. And like I said, the questions are usually filled by one person in every household and covers every person in the household. Nowadays, we receive the questionnaire from the census and from the American Community Survey on the mail. You have the option to answer that questionnaire by hand, or there is also information that you can answer. You can get into a website using the number that's provided in the questionnaire and answer that online. So it's much more efficient way. You don't have to send the questionnaire back, right? And this one here is the example of the short questionnaire for the 2010 decennial census in the US. So you ask how many people were living or staying in that specific house, apartment, or home, mobile home on April 1st, 2010. So April 1st in the US is the census date, is the date that all the questions refer to. How many people were living here in April 1st? What's the name of the age of the people here in this household in April 1st? So everything refers to April 1st. And in the long questionnaire about the ACS, the same thing, everything in relation to April 1st. If someone reaches your house in May to ask this questionnaire, but actually moves there in April 15, then you are not going to be interviewed, right? Because you were not living in that household. Were there any additional people staying here on April 1st? Is this house, apartment, or mobile home owned or rented? What's the phone number? And then these questions here, these are general questions about the household. And this second column here are questions that I ask for each individual, about each individual. The head of the household answers for everybody. Last name, first name, middle initial, sex, age, and just to confirm, date of birth. And that's the age on April 1st, 2010. The question about ethnicity, whether the person is of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, race, and does person want sometimes leave or stay somewhere else, for example, for college and so on, or for some other reason. And here in this, specifically in this page here, I do not have the question about what's the relationship of that person with the head of the household, but that's also asked in the short form of the census, okay? And censuses, they usually follow one or another style in relation to where people live. They have this de jure or de facto census. What is a de jure census? It counts persons based on their usual, normal place of residence. As I just mentioned before, in the US, the census day is April 1st. So the questions in the census relate to people answering all these questions related to their place of residence on April 1st. The de facto countries that apply more de facto census, they count people based on their location at the day that the person that is asking the questions reached you. I reached that household on April 5th, that household on April 17th, that other household on April 22nd. I asked questions about that specific day. The de facto census are usually more common because they are cheaper. It's easier to ask questions about that specific date, find people whatever day where they are, and ask questions about their residence at that specific time. The de jure is more complicated. If I'm talking about the census, I have to be careful to ask where people were on that specific date of reference. Here in the US, we call it census day. And we have to, and surveys like the American Community Survey, if they reach your household and you were not living there on April 1st, you do not answer that question. But for the census, you have to answer questions based on where you were on that specific census day. There is a document on the website that I will just show you a list of countries that have the de jure and the de facto, just for curiosity in this case. But I will continue on this lecture on Tuesday, it's already 4:30. And I will also show you some links that are available in our course website in which you can see, you can get demographic data for your own research or for some other reason. Okay, so I will show that as well after I finish these slides. And remember that the assignment 1 were 3 points, short essay question. It's due at noon on Tuesday. Okay, and it's already available, the questions that I showed you at the beginning in the course website. Okay, so thank you very much, and I see you guys on Tuesday, and have a great weekend. Thank you.